Oh, great. It's now live streaming. Mark.
Okay. I believe we're now live streaming. So I'd like to begin by welcoming those members of the public and press who are watching via the live stream of this meeting via the council's website. Minutes of the meeting will be produced in the usual way, and a recording of the meeting will be available to view on the meeting page of the council website. To enable the meeting to run in an orderly manner, I would ask all members of the forum who have video cameras to keep the camera switched on for the duration and to keep their microphone muted except when invited to speak. Officers will join us to introduce their reports in the same way. Any members wishing to ask questions or make a comment should indicate this by clicking the raised hand function on the right-hand side of your screen. When the chair invites you to speak, please unmute your microphone, ask your question and then mute it again to allow the officer to respond. Ask for your patience if we run into technical problems, and should this occur, Chair will declare an adjournment while the fault is addressed and the public broadcast will be paused. If it's not possible to address the fault, the meeting may be abandoned until such a time as it can be reconvened. I'd like to welcome Joanne Pope to her first meeting of Forum as the Maintained School Governor Representative. Would the Democratic Services Officer report any apologies at absence, please?
Apologies received from Mark Vickers, Councillor Claire Daunton, Helen Brooke, substituted by Adrian Miller, Kat Thompson, Alison Anderson, Lisa Peacock, Simone Taylor, Councillor Simone Taylor, Nadine Gooding-Hewitt.
Thank you very much. Does any member wish to declare any disclosable pecuniary interest or non-statutory disclosable interest? No. Thank you very much indeed. We'll then move on to agreeing minutes for accuracy. Go through the minutes page by page. Please raise your hand and give me a moment to hopefully see it on the screen, as I'm having to work across multiple ones to be able to manage that at the same time. So if we're looking at the Schools Forum minutes for last time, I'm seeing them as page 3 of 80 on the agenda document pack. Anybody? Ryan, you've raised your hand straight out of the gate.
There's no H in my name, but seeing as what's coming, if we can leave my name like that, then anything that comes I can't be held accountable for later on, or we can take it out.
Thank you very much, Ryan. That will be a removal of an H. You are Kelsall, not Kelshaw. Thank you very much, or Kelshall, however you would like to pronounce it. That's page 1. I'll move on to the next page. No, page 3. 4. 5. 6. 7. Okay. Seems to me that everybody's agreed then as the correct record with the one change to the spelling of Ryan's surname. The action log is included with the minutes for noting. Anything we wish to draw attention to particularly on there, Tamar? No?
Sorry, no.
No. I think everything's been done that was expected to be done. Thank you very much. So that moves us on to the High Needs Monitoring Working Group update from Sarah, please.
Sarah's there, she's just on mute. Can't hear you, Sarah. No, I don't think she's there. Okay. Sarah, are you there? I'll just message her. It won't be a moment. Chair, I think she's rejoining the meeting. It looks like she's She's got a problem.
While Sarah's doing that, we'll just give her a moment. That's probably the best thing to do. If not, Martin, could you be preparing yourself to take on balances and deficit intervention if required?
Yep, no problem, Mark.
Thank you, Martin.
It looks like she's still joining.
Okay. Shall we move on to that? Because I've not heard anything, rather than keeping colleagues waiting. So if we can skip forward now through Sarah's 2 items to the school balances and deficit intervention, Martin, if you could introduce that report. We'll go back to 3 and 4 later.
Yep, no problem at all, Mark. That's fine. Okay, so this is a report on really just to kind of update on kind of obviously the financial challenges that we're facing at the moment across all schools, all sectors, in terms of the balances and the increasing number of deficits for both maintained schools and academies. So effectively what we've done to start off with is try and collate some of the information for maintained schools based on their forecast balances to the end of the 31st of March of the current financial year. Obviously, as you can see from the table in 2.1 of the report, if all of the forecasts come in as being as expected by individual maintained schools, we're going to see a significant reduction in balances from the end of the last financial year. So as at 31st of March 2024, we had total maintained school balances of 11.5 million. If they were all to come in as currently forecast, that would reduce down to around 4.6 million, so a reduction of over 6.8, nearly 6.9 million in year. And as you'll all be aware, this is an issue for all schools, and I think Mark and Ryan were keen to make this clear that this is affecting academies as well as maintained schools. At the moment, obviously, we're not able to collect the academy data in the same way. Previously, it was published as part of the academy's accounting returns information, but the DfE have changed the way in which that's published at the moment. So we can get information from either individual academy accounts or from some of the financial benchmarking websites, but it is much harder to collate than it was previously. So one of the things we have discussed and opened for discussion and comment later is whether actually a data collection exercises from academies and multi-academy trusts might be useful to help inform discussions going forward at future forum meetings. But we'll pick that up at the end. Okay, so obviously, as I say, maintained balances are showing a significant reduction in the levels going forward, and obviously the reasons for this are kind of pretty clear to most people in terms of obviously mainly the reduction in the uplifts in funding, which don't meet the costs for increases in costs that you're all facing in individual schools. We've seen, as we've said previously, changes in pupil numbers, which are massively impacting on the sustainability and class structures in schools as well. And obviously the high needs issues as well, which we'll obviously come back to in terms of the feedback from the high needs working group in terms of that continuing increase in complexity of need and the funding challenges that come alongside that in terms of the pressures on individual schools in terms of that. At 2.4 and 2.5, we're just kind of visually showing, again, for the maintained schools, the kind of changes in the levels of deficits being held by schools and how they've kind of, those with the higher levels of surpluses are reducing and how those who are going into deficit are increasing. And I think the kind of the graph at 2.5 is kind of a visual representation of that. And when I was discussing this with Jonty, I was calling it a tsunami towards deficit as it kind of moved to the left of the graph as more and more schools' balances are reducing and more are moving towards that deficit position, which you can see over time, over the last 3 years there in terms of those numbers. So obviously we know we've got a significant number of schools in financial difficulty. At the moment, we have got 34 maintained schools in deficit of varying sizes and for varying reasons that we're working with various different levels of intervention within those schools. Some of the schools have got what I would consider to be robust recovery plans in place and are continuing to deliver those. Other schools, due to their individual circumstances, there isn't an obvious solution as it stands at the current time in terms of how they're going to get out of a deficit position in the next couple of years. So to try and support that process, been working with Alison Kramer and the school's improvement service and other colleagues and other services to look at what we can do in terms of kind of improving the kind of intervention process and rigor around working with maintained schools, around looking at what we can do around the whole deficit intervention process. So as is set out in Appendix B of the report, we've kind of started to kind of pull together what we consider to be a kind of a deficit intervention escalation process, which kind of builds on some previous conversations we've had around putting in place kind of different groups to support schools in terms of the finance support group, which will be there to provide that support and rigor to schools who are in financial deficit, and a financial improvement group, which will kind of be the next stage up for those schools where there are considerably greater challenges in terms of the delivery of deficit recovery within those individual schools. Obviously, within that kind of flow chart, we've set out the powers of the local authority at those different intervention levels. Obviously, what we want to try and avoid is the kind of the withdrawal of delegation and the removal of that delegated responsibility, not least because of the kind of the challenges that would bring in terms of considering that suspension of schools' budgets at an individual level. In terms of that. So obviously appreciate that this is, it's a very challenging situation at the moment for all schools, not just maintained schools. Obviously, this kind of protocol mainly will apply to our maintained schools colleagues, but obviously we need to look at ways of working with maintained schools and academies, across all sectors to look at the sustainability in terms of that. And I think, as I said, it feeds back into the high needs block paper that we'll be talking about. And equally, as we go forward into the place planning paper, I think these are all interlinked in terms of the challenges which are being faced by individual schools, regardless of phase or status. So I'll kind of pause there for kind of any comments and questions. And I say just a particular interested in views from academy colleagues and whether they think a data collection exercise around academy balances would add value, or if that's something that's already in place through your various groups.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Martin. Colleagues, comments or questions for Martin? As he said, anybody wish to comment on the circumstances that they are facing? Not a soul, it would appear, at this time. I think you've stunned people into silence.
Okay, just to say the next stages for maintained schools is we're going to work, as I say, with the terms of reference for both the FSG and the finance intervention groups with that, and we're going to circulate something out to maintained schools before Easter or maybe just after, depending on the timing. So there'll be some further guidance coming out to maintained schools on that. Sarah and I also attended CPH last week, and we've agreed to keep that dialogue going with CPH around the kind of the particular deficit issues. And again, I'd open that invitation up to CSH as well if they want a particular targeted conversation around funding on that basis as well. I'm more than happy to come along to future meetings on that. But unless there are any other comments, so there's nothing more I really want to say on this at the moment. Other than just to recognise that the challenges are system-wide at the present time.
Again, thank you, Martin. Anybody else wish to make any comment at all? Because I'm quite happy to pick some quick comments up. I don't know, Mr. John Colpin, if I can just ask, has CCF discussed anything along these lines? Martin was alluding to potentially we've picked it up as an academy sector around funding.
Detail. We've obviously had conversations regarding the overall poor funding picture, conversations that were shared actually with the DfE, and obviously the pressures regarding changes to national insurance, etc., and the sort of things that the Martin's raised previously. We've got a CCF meeting taking place in 2 weeks' time. It'll probably be something on the agenda there, and if it's helpful, I can have that conversation about how much academies would obviously contribute to this debate that you've said, Martin, in terms of sort of sharing where academies actually are, sort of compare alongside maintained schools. Anecdotally, I think the point you make is spot on. Academies are in no different a situation really from the vast majority of maintained schools with the huge pressures that we're actually facing at the moment, and some of the unpalatable choices, decisions that all schools are having to make at this particular point. But I can certainly bring that to the CCF agenda in a couple of weeks' time.
Thanks very much, John. Nikki, I see your hand's been raised.
Thanks. Yeah. It was just to pick up on the point that Martin raised about coming to CPH and the conversations that were had there. We were really grateful to Martin for the paper that he presented around funding and the opportunity to talk that through. But one of the points was very much around putting any correspondence that goes to school governing bodies regarding their financial position within a context of what is happening across the county, so that individual schools are not feeling as though they are the only school in this position. So really it was a call for greater transparency and honesty in those communications. And also we felt at CPH that there really was a need to take a position on deficits and to have again, an open and honest conversation to say, when we are licensing deficits, having transparency about the kind of circumstances where they would be licensed, because we all know that much of the debt is to do with meeting the needs of pupils with SEND. And we would really appreciate a position where if a school is going into deficit because of meeting those needs, we have got a clarity about that and a position from the local authority.
Thank you very much, Nikki. Mary, I believe your hand is next, unless Martin, you wanted to pick anything up from Nikki's points?
No, just completely agree. And so we had those conversations at CPH, and I think the context is key, Nikki, in terms of making it clear that it's, everybody is in a similar position in terms of that. And and the point around the high needs is again, it's a system-wide issue, but I think there does need to be recognition that that is obviously for a lot of schools is what is pushing them kind of over the edge in terms of that over deficit. So I think you're right, that does need to be recognised.
Thank you, Martin and Nikki. Mary.
Hi, Martin. Special heads appreciate that you were due on an agenda, but that you won't be able to make the next special heads.
Yep.
Can you just assure us that you will attend a special heads meeting to share the same type of information? As you know, most of our schools are heading for a deficit position. Yeah, no, more than happy to attend a future one. It just happens to clash with the F40 conference that I'm attending next week. So I'm kind of representing us at that conference to try and understand what's happening elsewhere. And obviously we'll feed back to this group from that meeting. But yeah, I'm more than happy to be on a future agenda for special heads, Mary. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. Anybody else? Or I'll just share. We have a letter. I just tried to share it in the chat, but I'm not enabled to be able to share files. And it does come from the F40 group, of which Cambridgeshire has been a long-standing member. And I think that has particularly something to do with how apparently rapidly we're moving towards deficit in so many Cambridgeshire schools. This austerity that we're hitting at the moment isn't new to Cambridgeshire. And I think those schools that are in the F40 are finding it particularly hard, as the reserve levels aren't the same as they are in other parts of the country. So F40 have sent a letter that suggests that we engage with our MPs, sent to them to suggest that it's not down to any one of us. There are people, Martin and I had a conversation around larger schools with stable roles, low levels of SEND. They're less likely to be heading into these situations at the moment with good estates, all the other sorts of positive things. They shouldn't be used as examples of where particular people are doing things better than other people who find themselves in more challenging, higher levels of SEND, more deprivation in the community. And as the item that's next on the agenda will pick up around lower pupil numbers, etc., it shouldn't be being used. I think with particular individual head teachers, we need to see this as a system-wide problem. There was also an excellent paper which I suggest we circulate from F40 around how it doesn't only play out in your ORCU funding, these issues have been there for years in your SEND funding, and our comparative SEND funding in Cambridgeshire is behind many of our local peers. We are again hitting these problems very early on and very hard in terms of the way the system's working at the moment. When you watch what Martin's obviously worked his way through there, and you'll have all worked this out as quickly as I did, if it's another year like this, and actually what we're seeing in our budgets as they're arriving in an academy trust at this point is we're seeing an uplift of about 0.7, 0.8% in Cambridgeshire, the 0.5 promised, and a bit from the reduction in the movement of money to the high needs block support. That's it. When we model that with a 2.8% staff pay rise with no idea of what's happening with support staff, our budgets for the next year look worse, considerably worse than they do for this year. And I'm imagining, despite the work that Martin and colleagues will undertake at CPH, you're going to be faced with one of two things: a completely unsustainable budget, or having to make cuts to schools when people are unable to afford to be able to do for children, both what we're being asked to do and what we believe we should do. I was very keen to have this item on the agenda today because I don't think it's acceptable, and I don't think it's right that we shouldn't be shouting out very loudly at this point. So if it's okay with colleagues, I will circulate the F40 paper, but if anybody wants to do some work with us, and we can do that through CPH, CSH, CCF and Forum, because I think it's vital that we all work together, we need to make our local members of parliament absolutely clear of what we're being asked to do. Sorry, John, you put your hand up while I was going on.
Probably just picking up the last point, Mark. We have discussed this before as Forum, but unsuccessfully. I wonder whether there's a possibility of inviting our members of parliament to come along to a forum meeting and actually hear what we're all saying, and the situation that Martin has set out, and which we can reinforce from the Academy's point of view as well. I think actually some of those MPs do actually need to hear just how desperate the situation is and lobby a lot harder in Parliament for an adequate level of funding and appropriate funding for Cambridgeshire.
Thank you, John. Maybe Sarah, Martin, myself can catch up and probably engage with the representative groups and maybe invite them along, if not to a full forum, to a specific meeting in which we'd like to address these concerns. Okay. Anybody else, or shall we move on? I think it probably makes sense to move on to the places planning and then circle back to the high needs block and BAPE, if that's okay with colleagues.
That's fine, Mark.
Okay, thank you ever so much indeed. And on the places planning, sorry, I'm just going to have to move my agenda back. The officer presenting on that looks like Alison's appeared on the screen. Is that because you're owning it?
Yes, that's correct. Hi, Mark.
Excellent. Please do carry on. Thanks ever so much, Alison.
Thank you. So what we've brought today is just a sort of summary presentation on school place planning. There is a lot more detailed information that we have and that we will share in different places, but I think it was to start the discussion here and then to work out what level of detail appropriately comes here, what goes to subgroups and to other fora. So just taking through, it's a very sort of short slide deck really, just to give the position of where we are in terms of our birth data and the tools that we're using for place planning. So on the first slide, which shows the the number of births by year and the forecast births by year. This shows us that there was a sustained growth in the total number of births, but the annual number of births now has fallen in 2022. So there were just over 6,600 births in Cambridgeshire in 2022, compared to a peak 10 years earlier of 7,700. So we can see that overall the birth rate is dropping significantly. But obviously, when we're looking at our forecast births, we're looking at the data that we hold, the trend data, and then we also take into account the local authorities, the local district authorities' expected levels of net housing completions, which also are now contributing to that slight rise that we can see in the forecasts over the coming period. So we take into account a number of factors when we're projecting this data, and we look at the planned housing developments as well. So there's a fall in the birth rate, but we know that there are planned housing developments that are going to see an increase overall in the population size. Moving on to the next slide. the next slides really are just really to say that we do that forecasting. We do it at a local authority level, county-wide. We also do it at planning area level. So we have 45 planning areas across the primary phase in Cambridgeshire, and we also do forecast and catchment data for individual schools, and that is shared with all schools in the autumn term, and it is on the Cambridgeshire Learn Together page, so schools can access their individual forecasts, so they can see what the predictions are for numbers for individual schools. So it's carried out on a number of levels, and that is accessible to each school, and we share that with schools, and we can provide more details on that and the methodology we use for that. Then if we move on to the next two slides, they're very high level, and appreciate they're rather large. Sort of the scale of this doesn't really give the detailed information on the numbers, but this is sort of just showing really the sort of the overall projection of our pupil number projections compared to the published admission number. And we've added a few charts in here, one for showing the reception and and the second chart is showing year 7, so that we can see that we have got that increased demand, particularly in year 7, but with this to note that the published admission numbers used in these charts are not showing the new schools that are planned to open, because we don't have exact confirmed dates on the opening dates of those, because as colleagues on this meeting will be aware, there are a number of factors that have to be put in place to agree the exact opening date of a school. So those published admission numbers will shift because there will be new secondary schools opened, in particular at secondary, it's Alconbury Weald and Darwin Green there that we haven't yet factored into the PAN. And then the final slide in the slide deck is just sort of highlighting some of those tools that we use to manage demand. So we obviously, where we've got decreasing demand, we can reduce published admission numbers. We can we sort of reduce the use of some of the accommodation in a school, and also where we've got those increases, as you'll be aware, we increase permanent capacity, we increase temporary capacity with temporary accommodation. Some years we've implemented bold classes, and we've also got permanent PAN increases. So there are a number of elements that we consider when doing our place planning, and we do a very, very detailed, every year we do a school an education organisation plan that is about a 78-page report that we publish, that has that really detailed level of place planning by planning area and by districts, and looks at the situation for individual areas and where we've got demand and pressures and what our proposals are in relation to those. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Comments, questions from colleagues? None again. Must be it's a Friday afternoon thing. There's just a couple from me. You mentioned, I can see there's a parallel obviously between what Martin was talking about around where there's low birth rates or low numbers coming into reception, etc. Is that being, have we got plans to handle that in particular areas now? Are there meetings arranged with colleagues to start to talk about the sorts of solutions that you've just drawn up?
We don't have those meetings in yet, but we have them internally as officers, but we haven't yet set up those meetings with schools. So we're working through that plan internally, and then we will make those approaches. We do talk to schools individually if there are particular issues at a school level, but we haven't yet put those sort of broader planning area sessions in. But we will be doing that as we move forward, as we're firming up those plans, Mark.
No, thank you. I think that's absolutely vital at the moment.
Yeah.
As many of us will all be sitting there thinking about PAN changes and other significant changes, it makes sense for us to be collaborating in that, so we understand what's really happening in an area, as opposed to all running off in separate directions to each other. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anybody else? No? Okay. Thank you very much indeed. We'll circle our way back. Thank you, Alison. We'll circle our way back now to the item on the High Needs Working Party. Sarah, hopefully the technology will all flow this time correctly.
Let's hope so, Mark.
That's a good start.
Yeah, apologies for that. So I'm going to do the two updates then. The update on the High Needs Block subgroup, and then I'll pause for questions and then go into the update on the review of the independent review of the BAPE arrangements. So starting with the High Needs Block subgroup. So our first meeting was convened on the 25th of February, and that followed discussion at Schools Forum in December, where Forum did support the disapplication of 0.5% transfer from schools block to the high needs block. But this was very much on the proviso that we accelerated the programme for the enhanced resource blocks, so specialist provision on mainstream sites, to address the growing deficit within the high needs block. Although it's accepted that there'll always be some kind of demand for specialist independent provision. So the presentation that was circulated to support this item, I'm not proposing to go through that presentation, but if just on slide 2, there's a list of 6 items: governance, financial position, enhanced resource-based programme update, high needs capital application, and banded top up, and they were the areas of focus within the original, that first meeting. So the terms of reference were previously circulated to Schools Forum, and the idea of the subgroup was create a forum for system leaders from representative schools across the county to work with senior officers to review the spend within the high needs block, so that we can address those unsustainable financial pressures that are driven by demand and that are linked to the other items in terms of school deficits and also pupil-placed planning, because as Alison's described, mainstream demand may be starting to decline, but obviously in parallel, we've got a big surge and an incline in terms of special educational needs. So how do we link strategically the financial viability of schools and our pupil-placed planning, whilst also considering managing those places for special educational needs? So the subgroup will make recommendations to Forum that make better use of available resources, that enable children with SEND and AP to access education in mainstream provision where appropriate. So I'll just run through the actions that emerged from the meeting on the 25th. So Mark, as Chair of Schools Forum, chaired the initial meeting, and Ryan has put himself forward as Deputy Chair of Schools Forum to chair the high needs block subgroup going forward. We had a discussion about the governance, because if the high needs block subgroup is going to be effective, then obviously we have to have things in place that link it to the wider governance structures within the council. So I did present a very rough and ready visual that described the current governance arrangements, but I have taken an action to pull that together more coherently. We do have to have a local area partnership meeting that progresses our strategic support to children and young people with SEND. At the moment, we've got a SEND exec board and we have an operational partnership group. We need to review that so that we've got the local area partnership. So that's one of the items that will influence the governance arrangements, because obviously our strategic thinking needs to be underpinned by our financial strategy. So it was quite a bit ambitious agenda for the first subgroup. So what we all agreed was that we would need task and finish groups that would drive forward the different areas of spend in the high needs block. And they included the BAPE, and I'll come back to that on the next item, the ERBs, and also SEND funding and placement planning. So we talked about top-up funding in mainstream and special schools, but the scope of the group was quite broad, and so those subgroups will enable us to have space to devote to those individual work streams. Financial position was the financial position was presented, and Martin set out a breakdown by placements type. What the action that we took away was that we would review that financial information under the 4 areas within the code of practice rather than all the different designated needs. We also talked about the high needs capital allocations, and John Jordan did pull together some quite detailed information, but because we had quite an ambitious agenda, We didn't get a chance to go through that in detail. So that is something that we do need to revisit, because obviously in the rollout of the ERBs, we need to be confident that we've also got the capital investment, and we need to obviously have a timescale for delivery. So I do think that the fact that Ryan's now offered to be the chair and is looking to appoint representatives to those work strands within the subgroup, this will enable us to have much more collaboration around approaches moving forward around the high needs block spend. And obviously by linking it to the schools forum and the wider governance arrangements, there will be greater transparency around any proposals and the decisions taken against those proposals. So I'll pause there for questions, comments, clarity before I go into the update on the BAPE. Thank you.
Sarah, colleagues, questions, comments, anything that any colleagues who are part of the working party would like to share? Please raise your hand. Ryan, thank you.
So I think one of the things that Mark and I discussed with Sarah and Martin on Monday was a need for genuine open collaboration and discussion. I think Sarah's coming on to the BAPE element of that, and what's come out the back of the work that had gone on with the local authority is that this needs to be done, as Sarah said, much more transparently, and forum we felt was a good opportunity to do that. I think the other thing that forum have been asking for is to have some real clarity about timelines and to work with a level of urgency that is required to address these issues. And so those who are in the high needs working group will see that a number of meetings have come out, one on April the 4th, one on May the 12th, and then one on June the 27th. And the two latter meetings happen a couple of weeks before forum to allow us to come back to forum with some clear milestones initially, with the aim being to come back to forum with some recommendations around the three key areas that we're looking at, which is the ERB rollouts and review and expansion, potentially SEND placement and funding, and the BAPE, for the local authority to then consider and adopt, review, adapt, with a view to working towards implementation throughout 25-26, and have us in a much stronger position from a co-produced position ready for launch in September 26 as a kind of time frame. I had a message from Tony asking about kind of face-to-face, and I think what the model will be, hopefully, is that the task and finish groups will have some more face-to-face and on-the-ground interaction, but we'll bring all of that back together through the three online high needs groups. And the first bit of action for Mark and I has been to work to try and identify leads of those three groups and make sure they're representative. And in relation to the BAPE group, I've approached Christopher Bennett, who is a forum member and a BAPE lead, to work on leading that team, which would include the BAPE leads. And I know Richard is a member of forum, is in that role, and others, and then other forum members who wish to be within that group. Mark and I have approached Mary to lead on the placement and funding around SEND, and I know Mary's worked with special heads and the chair of the special heads group to look at banding already. So there's a natural progression of that work which has stalled somewhat, which we think could be really meaningful to look at funding for special, but also funding for mainstream placements and how we can make that more consistent and more effective to allow for inclusive practice within mainstream schools. That links into slightly the ERB element, and the ERB element needs to really take the form of a review of what's in place and a look at the existing agreements, funding arrangements, parameters of what goes on there to kind of align and secure that to allow us then to look at growth in a consistent and appropriate way. So what we'll be looking to do is for colleagues who've put themselves forward for that high needs group to come back to us and say which of those 3 task and finish groups they wish to join. My plan is to go out and meet with the leads of those groups in the next few weeks to kind of set the direction of travel, and then they will take on that work leading those groups with an initial kind of milestone of May the 12th to come back, to come to the April the 4th meeting with a kind of sense of what they're looking to do and firm up who's in each of those groups. May the 12th come back with some kind of milestone actions of where they've got to, and then coming back on June the 27th with their kind of formulated proposals for each of those 3 areas that we'll then share back into forum on July the 11th, with the aim that the local authority will take those away and come back to us at the first forum meeting in the new academic year to say this is what we are going to be doing in these 3 areas. Mark, does that sound like a appropriate summary of kind of what we've discussed and laid out as a roadmap?
Yeah, well, I think so. I think it's good to check with Sarah. The only thing I would add, I think, Brian, to it is we've talked with Sarah about identifying officers who will be, because it's very clearly, it's us supporting and working with officers on making sure that this happens. I think it is inevitable. We don't like things being done to. That means we have to do things with. And that's kind of the shift that we're trying to make sure that we happen here. Sarah was also talking about providing the administrative support to be able to make those things happen. And I think using the expertise and the knowledge that's there within the teams makes good sense. So yeah, Ryan, I think that's captured it. It's all a bit nascent, isn't it, in terms of suck it and see, whatever the right posh ways of saying that are, trial and error a little bit, but I think we're trying to step into a period of collaborative action. So thank you. Helena's just raised her hand, Ryan, if that's all right.
I was just going to quickly say that Sarah had done that already and has put the ERB lead officer, I think, in touch with me to link that across. So we're already on the case with that, which is good.
Brilliant. Thank you. Helena, sorry. Oh, you've dropped your hand? It's gone.
No,
we'll go to John.
I politely put it down.
Yeah, please do.
I was just going to share sort of reflections from a Cambridgeshire secondary head's perspective. We met this week and Sarah kindly gave us an update as part of our meeting. I think while there's clearly lots of activity and busyness happening to kind of gain momentum around this piece of work, I think what came back as a request from the CSH was just some very high level milestone information, timelines to provide assurances and to give them a sense of the scope and the scale of this project, because they won't necessarily have as much detailed appreciation of the various task and finish work groups that Sarah's described and Ryan is part of. So we'd welcome that to just keep everybody in the loop really and understand the direction of travel with that and what to expect when.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much indeed. And I think that's partly because we wanted to make sure that we were effectively gaining the support forum to do those things today. And that will then follow up because it's all bits of paper scrapped together for the minute, but we'll convert it into something shareable very soon. Thank you. John, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Mark. I mean, it just comes back to also a conversation that both of us actually had with Martin and Sarah earlier on in the week, where it was acknowledged there's lots of really good things happening actually in Cambridgeshire and in Cambridgeshire schools. And actually what we've got an opportunity to do here with these task and finish groups is to actually identify some of that really impressive practice and to build on it and spread that effectively across the whole of Cambridgeshire. Undoubtedly we face really significant challenges, but actually we shouldn't lose sight that the individual schools, groups of schools doing some really quite impressive things. And I think that was possibly shared with inspectors as well, Sarah, if I'm not speaking out of turn. And it's now critical that we build upon that. So I think it's also a point where we should actually recognise that lots of things we're doing extremely well.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, John. Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to thank you, Mark and John, because it was a difficult but very productive meeting that we had, I think, and it cleared the air a lot with Martin. And just to pick up the comments on the timeline, we have plotted a timeline that obviously now I need to work through with yourself, Ryan, as chair. So we've done some work to pull that together. And when we were at Secondary Heads, when I was at Secondary Heads, I did agree that I would come to the conference and present that timeline that gives confidence about what will happen and when and who will be involved. And we also said that we'd do the same at your meeting, John, of the MAT CEOs with Martin, that obviously links this in to the strategic direction and the vision for children and young people, particularly with SEND moving forward, but more broadly, our vision for education and how everything links and joins up. And I think once we've got that clarity, it's going to be much better for everybody to be able to hold us to task in terms of what's happened, has it happened within timeline, and what are the actual success criteria that's illustrating that we have been impactful. So I do feel that it may have come from some quite challenging conversations, but I feel like we're in a much better position. And I agree, John, there was a similar dialogue with inspectors during inspection that recognised there's some fantastic and innovative practice across Cambridgeshire. We're not always that good at joining it up across services. So that's something that we are committed to doing much more effectively. And we're looking forward to doing that in a co-productive way with colleagues across Forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm just waiting to see if anybody else. There's a bit of chat, but I think that's all resolved itself in terms of how people were discussing things. Checking there's nobody else with hands up. If not, Sarah, then hopefully we can beautifully segue over into BAPES now.
Yes, thank you. So in terms of the BAPE, I'm going to be very frank in the discussion here. So, and I think it picks up some of the comments that we've just had. So I need to start by saying it is recognised that the current BAPE arrangements have contributed to an improved position with regard to permanent exclusion of young people from secondary schools in Cambridgeshire. I've got the data in front of me, and I can see that, at the point of inception, the permanent exclusions were really low. In 21-22, we only had 7 permanent exclusions. 22-23, it's risen to 15. 23-24, it was 25, and currently year to date for 24-25, it's actually 29 permanent exclusions, which for a large county is low, but obviously is growing, and that was what contributed to the commissioned independent review of the BAPE arrangements. So in the spirit of transparency, I shared the summary report from that independent review and convened a meeting on the 27th of February to discuss the options and recommendations arising from that review. The invite was extended to all MAT CEOs and secondary head teachers, and the objective was to share the recommendations of that review so that we could reach an agreement on the way forward. The review was commissioned, as I understand it, in May 2024, so does precede me joining Cambridgeshire. But since that time, there has been considerable churn within the council, with senior leaders leaving, and with the SEND service been in a bit of a state of flux, which we are addressing. We're currently looking at plugging some of those capacity gaps and redesigning the service so that there is sufficient capacity. So the executive summary report was shared with forum members, and what I realised very, very clearly when we had the meeting was that the status of the BAPE review has been undermined and can't be seen to reflect the current picture across the county. That was very clearly evident in the discussion that we had at the meeting. It was clear that people had not been consulted, and on that basis it didn't reflect the views, opinions, experience of the system leaders who have been influential in implementing and delivering the BAPE arrangements. So what we decided was instead that the newly established, as Ryan's just talked about, the newly established high needs block subgroup will agree a task and finish group to review the current model, and we want to do that with full engagement of the BAPE leads. I've got a meeting I think it's next week, with the BAPE leads to arrive at proposals for a process that responds to the context that we're operating within now. And I think it's important to stress that the reason we're reviewing it isn't because of performance impact. It's about recognising the pressures that we've discussed in numerous reports that is driven by that increase in demand. So the objective of the task and finish group will be to work collaboratively to arrive at a model that meets need within available resources, recognising that the demand for appropriate provision has increased significantly since the BAPE arrangements were agreed. Consideration will be given to the decision-making processes across the BAPE models and the outcomes, obviously, for young people accessing support through the BAPE arrangements, so that best practice can be shared and used to inform a revised approach. And critically, there'll be no changes to the current BAPE arrangements that are not collaboratively arrived at and agreed through the BAPE task and finish group via the high needs block subgroup and reported back recurrently to Schools Forum. The council is the decision maker for high needs block funding, but we do need to consult with members of Schools Forum, and we are committed to ensuring that decisions around funding are made collaboratively, and we work in that way that supports co-production moving forward. So again, I'll pause there to take comments, feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. Richard, your hand is raised. Hi.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to ask about those rising numbers of PXs, and just to what extent is it systemic and spread across the county? Is there geographical hotspots, school context hotspots, trust hotspots, etc.? And what bearing would that have on the collaboration going forward?
Yeah, well, good question. And I can't give you now the breakdown, but I think that will have to obviously be part of the data that informs proposals moving forward, because we need to better understand. There's differences, isn't there, in terms of how the BAPE arrangements operate currently, and that's why it's important that we have the meeting with yourself and the other BAPE leads to understand how the model works, and I guess the criteria in terms of what's influencing those permanent exclusions, because we do have to have some consistency, of course, across any models moving forward. And I think there has been a lack of scrutiny or quality assurance from a local authority perspective. Our accountability in that process, we can devolve the funding, but we can't devolve the accountability. So I think that has to shape some of the thinking within the task and finish group, Richard, and I'm very happy to bring that level of data and the trend data as well into those discussions.
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful. I mean, I'm very encouraged by the discussions that I'm hearing at the moment that have been taking place and the transparency. And I think in what you're talking about, that greater transparency and looking at the data, etc., will hopefully bring in greater collaboration and have a more systemic approach to it, because there is certainly going to be strength in whatever comes out, that it's done collaboratively with as many of the stakeholders as possible. Thank you for that, Sarah.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Any other colleagues wish to refer or reference BAPEs? No? Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much indeed, local authority colleagues, for all of those presentations. I think it's been really important, even though it looks like it's going to be a very short meeting. I think it's really important that we have that opportunity to share progress and the fact that everybody's getting on with things and trying to do what we're hoping to realise very soon. I'll just take you to the Schools Forum agenda plan. Tamar, are there any additions to the forward plan?
Not that I'm aware of, unless officers have anything to add.
I just say I suspect a lot of the future actions or future papers are going to fall out of the high needs block subgroup work. So I think we'll just add that. And as we say, as Ryan said, we've got them scheduled to kind of feed into that program of work. So hopefully we can start to populate that going forward.
Thank you very much, Martin. And I will send the F40 SEND report for circulation, if that's okay, Tamar, and the letter that was suggested by the F40 group. If you could let us know if you've sent that to your local MP, it's a very helpful thing just to get a bit of a sense of, be it exactly that letter or something that's quite similar, be really useful to know. I think sometimes there's a danger that we assume someone else is going to do that job, which means we don't actually communicate quite the frustration that we have. Many of us have got used to setting budgets that make your eyes water and your heart sink, and then finding that there's a series of letters awarded to us which solve that problem, usually around August time, or something completely inconvenient in terms of budget setting or decision making. I'm not sure we're making as much noise as we should be at this point about how dreadful and frightening the things that we're facing are in schools. I do encourage colleagues to make sure they let the decision makers know how certainly we feel, and I could see local authority and a number of Academy Trust colleagues have been sharing. I know it's there in the FD forum, Martin, if that helps at all. The Academy's FD forum is awash with people feeling very unhappy. Absolutely, Helena, I've just seen your message pop up. Hello, Councillor Thompson. I see your hands raised. How are you?
I was just going to say, with regards to our MP, we obviously as councillors, we're all politically aligned, so we're more than happy to help in any way. My local MP in Solomon, I've been going to meetings with him and taking him to meetings, so he's very much involved and engaged on what we're doing. So if there's anything that is going out to him, it'd be great if I was copied in on that. Obviously, I understand we're talking about Cambridgeshire, there's quite a few different MPs, but we do have 3 Lib Dem MPs that I can very happily work with locally for you.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much for that offer. I think it's as many voices as we can possibly muster, really important at this moment. Okay, thank you very much indeed for that, and good to see you. Nikki.
I'm just thinking it might actually be worth referencing that we actually sent a letter to all of our MPs in November 2022, which from CPH, which basically outlined the prediction that schools would be going into deficit based on the surveys that we'd done about current funding. It outlined the anticipated average costs for primary schools having to find, for example, £45,000 for the support staff uplift, 20,000 to action the school teachers' pay and conditions recommendations on pay, and with those 2 aspects alone having to find £65,000 in the budget. It might be interesting to reference back to that letter, because we actually got quite a good response from that piece of correspondence that went to MPs, and basically looking back now 3 years later, everything that we said was going to happen in 2022 has now happened.
Right. That's absolutely spot on. It's a really good point to make as well as writing it independently. There's a real role in CPH, CSH and CCF, as John referenced, for us to pick up on what we're going to do with that. But I think if you can communicate back, if you make progress with it, that would be really helpful. But yeah, it is frightening, isn't it? We give the warnings and we're given expectations about improving all the time. We need the funding to be able to deliver. Thank you very much indeed. Any other comments? If not, then I'll bring that to the end of the meeting. Just slipped beyond 3 o'clock. The next Schools Forum meeting is a reserve date on the 21st of May 2025. Confirmation on whether this will go ahead will be sent out in due course, but I hope you're all with me in agreeing that I think we need to keep up momentum and make sure we all keep talking. So thank you ever so much for your time today. Hopefully you've got lovely things to do for the next 2 hours. Please enjoy and have a lovely weekend. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you.